people are angry, right? This is their lake. They expect the water to be clean and protected. They pay sewer and stormwater fees, and they expect those pipes to work.
Hi, I'm content producer Michael Barrett. In the past 3 years, more than a dozen sewage spills have affected the water in Lake Norman around Cornelius and Huntersville, making for some pretty negative headlines. So I met with Catawba Riverkeeper Brandon Jones of the Catawba Riverkeeper Foundation to get his assessment of the overall health of Lake Norman and the Catawba River in this area. Brandon, just to start out, tell me just a little bit about what the overall health is of the Catawba River and Lake Norman right here.
Sure. So every year we go through and do what we call what's the State of the River report. And so we break the Catawba River basin down into different areas. So obviously we don't want to say, hey, everything's all the same. You look up at Lake Norman versus Mountain Island Lake versus Lake Watery or any of the northern lakes, then you're going to have different answers. It also depends on what you're trying to do. Are you concerned about drinking water? Are you concerned about fishing? Are you concerned about eating the fish? Are you concerned about swimming? And so based on a lot of different parameters, I would say that in general, the water here on Lake Norman is excellent.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly some concerns with development, but overall, when we test, this is some of the best water in the basin.
So obviously, anytime you have a sewage spill, that gets a lot of attention. What's been your personal observation of the reaction to those here in the last 3 years?
Well, people are angry, right? This is their lake. They expect the water to be clean and protected. They pay sewer and stormwater fees, and they expect those pipes to work. And so I think it's really important that people understand that there are thousands of miles of pipes, and a lot of our infrastructure is over 100 years old. And so unfortunately, we are going to have these spills in the future. And the most important thing that people can do is report it. The utilities cannot measure every single drop that goes in and out, and so it's absolutely critical that if you see water or sewage or a smell going into any body of water, that you report that.
Is part of it, you think, just the nature of what happens and people hear the word sewage and they immediately assume, there's going to be major contamination that lingers for months, if not years?
People have a very visceral reaction to a sewage spill, and it's easy to understand why. Like we all know what that looks like and what it smells like. It's not the same as saying, there's forever chemicals or coal ash or PCBs. People understand exactly what sewage is, and they know it shouldn't be in the water. Yeah, so in the area directly beside the spill, the impacts are pretty severe. So you certainly do not want to be in the water directly adjacent to those spills. And then they can linger for 3 to 5 days and longer for the larger spills. But overall, they do dissipate, both from breaking down when they're exposed to UV radiation and the cold, and also just to the dilution from the massive amounts of water. So there's no real long-term impacts. But as they're happening, you just certainly don't want to be in the water.
So how do you guys at the Catawba Riverkeeper Foundation assess how well the water is recovering and bouncing back after a sewage spill?
Sure. So it depends on where the spill is and who's actually responding to it. Unfortunately, in North Carolina, it's kind of unusual in that while DEQ and our organization and such will actually go out there and take the measurements, it's up to the local county health department to actually make those no-swim advisories. So what we're really concerned about with the sewage spill are pathogens, so things that are going to make you sick. So you think of like viruses and certain bacteria, so things like Cryptosporidium or Shigella, the things that are going to make you really, really sick. And so that is in our sewage. And so when that gets in the water, that's the real danger. So we don't actually measure those specific bacteria because we don't want to grow a whole lot of that in the lab. So instead we measure E. coli, which are often associated with those and have a very high correlation. So we measure the counts of E. coli, and then the EPA and the state both have levels saying, okay, if there's above or below this amount of E. coli, then we expect it's safe to swim.
So Brandon, do you alone handle the water testing, or is it multiple people from the agency or the foundation?
It takes a village. So like I said, we work in close coordination. Charmex Stormwater has a fantastic program. They do a lot of samples. DEQ Mooresville will come out and take samples. We have a vast volunteer network. So while we just have maybe 5 staff scientists and we get as much as we can, we heavily rely on volunteers to go and get those samples, and interns as well to help us get them all back to the lab.
So in your estimation with these sewage spills, do you feel like the public scrutiny has been overblown or just misplaced, or just what's your take on it? Like, it's just understandable, I guess, but just...
Yeah, I think there's just been a lot more publicity this summer. There's been a lot more high profile spills in areas that get a lot of coverage. I wouldn't say there's been more spills this year than in the past, but the public is more aware of it. And once you get 1 or 2 and it's in the public eye, you start to get more reporting and it starts to get more coverage. So it creates a feedback cycle.
Right.
But I mean, I don't want to go swim in sewage either. And so the public has a right to know about these spills. They shouldn't be there. And I think it's a really important story to cover. Other than that, there's not a huge long-term impact on water quality. Like I said, they dissipate fairly quickly, and the pathogens are usually destroyed by the UV radiation they're exposed to. But excess nutrients can be a problem. And so it's not just pathogens, but it's also nitrogen and phosphorus, essentially fertilizer, right? And so right now, Lake Norman is classified as oligotrophic, which means there's a low level of nutrients, which keeps things like algal blooms and a lot of plant growth, down to a minimum. And so if we get long-term systemic inputs of nutrients, then we could see an increase in algal blooms like we have on Lake Wiley.
But it's a nice amenity. I guess you're just trying to say, don't get too crazy about the occasional spill. The river is correcting itself for the most part.
For the most part, the water quality is excellent for swimming. Just it's important that people stay informed. It's very easy to check our website, check CHARMEC or your local county health department.